Hey Satterton, this is Mr. Dubik here. In today's lesson, we're going to be talking about the second part of photosynthesis, which is the light-independent reaction, also known as the Calvin cycle. So before we get into the actual process of the light-independent reaction, I thought we would just kind of do an overview of the light-independent reaction so we all understand what is going on throughout this lesson. All right, so where does the light-independent reaction occur? It occurs in the stroma of the chloroplast. The stroma of the chloroplast is that fluid-like portion inside of the chloroplast. Now, how or what is going on during the light-independent reaction? And during the light-independent reaction, ATP and NADPH, which are the products of the light-dependent reaction, are going to combine with carbon dioxide to produce glucose. So essentially, what are we producing in the light-independent reaction that's so important for all photosynthetic organisms? And that is glucose, okay? Because remember, glucose is then going to be converted into ATP during cell respiration for energy, all right? So what is being released or what is being produced during or in the light-independent reaction? And that is glucose, C6H12O6. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about the actual process of the Calvin cycle. So the diagram to the left is showing you the process of the Calvin cycle, and you can see here you have carbon dioxide, which is a reactant of the Calvin cycle, as well as ATP and NADPH, okay, which are both stored energy molecules and are going to help convert carbon dioxide into glucose in the Calvin cycle. So to my right, I have some small notes that we're going to go over. So first, I thought we would just talk about the general overview of the Calvin cycle. So the Calvin cycle's general overview is that it converts carbon dioxide into glucose using ATP and NADPH, which carry stored energy. Okay, and we'll discuss that in a minute. So ATP and NADPH, why are they needed in the Calvin cycle? Well, if you can remember, ATP and NADPH are both produced in the light-dependent reaction. And the reason why they're produced in the light-dependent reaction and are needed for the Calvin cycle is because ATP and NADPH are both stored energy molecules. And what does that mean? Well, if you can remember that the main job of the ATP synthase in the light-dependent reaction is that the ATP synthase converts ADP into ATP by adding an extra phosphate. So essentially, by adding this extra phosphate, what you're doing is you're giving it more stored energy. Same thing with NADPH. NADPH is reduced in the light-dependent reaction from NADP plus to NADPH, and essentially what it's doing is it's receiving these high energy electrons as well as a extra hydrogen, which essentially is going to give it more energy, which is going to be needed in the Calvin cycle. All right, so ATP and NADPH carry energized electrons from the light-dependent reaction, which are used in the Calvin cycle to convert CO2 into glucose. And let's now talk about that using the diagram. Okay, so here we have our first reactant, carbon dioxide. Okay, and remember that carbon dioxide is going to be stored in the spongy mesophyll layer of the cells in a leaf. Okay, and when carbon dioxide is needed, it's going to travel up to the stroma, and it's going to be used here in the Calvin cycle. So carbon dioxide is then going to be reduced into 3-phosphoglycerate. Okay, and we need to convert 3-phosphoglycerate into glyceraldehyde, which is glucose. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to use the stored energy from ATP and NADPH to convert phosphoglycerate into glyceraldehyde. So now you all are probably thinking, well, why do we need to use ATP and NADPH? How are they going to help convert phosphoglycerate into glyceraldehyde? And if you can remember that ATP has 3-phosphate attached to the ribose sugar, and that third phosphate carries a whole lot of stored energy. So when energy is needed to initiate a chemical reaction, that third phosphate group is going to be broken off, and as that third phosphate group is broken off, energy is going to be released. So that energy is going to help convert phosphoglycerate into glyceraldehyde. Same thing with NADPH. If you can remember in the light-dependent reaction, NADP plus, okay, is going to use electrons and it's going to accept this hydrogen. So essentially now NADPH has more stored energy because of this hydrogen attached to it. And so when energy is needed, NADPH is going to break off this hydrogen right here to convert it back into NADP plus. And the releasing and the breaking of the bonds right here in between the phosphate and the hydrogen is going to release energy, and it also is going to release electrons, and those electrons are energized. And so now the breaking of the bonds from ATP and NADPH and the releasing of high energy electrons, all that is going to help convert carbon dioxide into phosphoglycerate, which is then going to be reduced into glyceraldehyde. All right. Now, what happens when ATP and NADPH are reduced back into ADP and NADP plus? Well, ADP and NADP plus are going to go back into the light-dependent reaction, and again, they're going to be reduced, and ADP is going to go back into ATP, all right, and NADP plus is going to be reduced back into NADPH in the thylakoid membrane in the light-dependent reaction. Okay. So once ATP and NADPH are reduced in the Calvin cycle, they will go back to ADP and NADP plus, which will travel back to the light reaction to become re-energized, so we can continue this whole process to again produce glucose. So overview of the light dependent and the light independent reaction. So here we're going to start off on the left hand side. We have the light dependent reaction, and what are the reactants for the light dependent reaction? They are sunlight and water. Where does the light dependent reaction occur? It occurs on the thylakoid membrane. And what does the light dependent reaction produce for the Calvin cycle? It produces ATP and NADPH, which are stored energy molecules. All right. So when ATP and NADPH enter the Calvin cycle, they're going to help reduce carbon dioxide into sugars for the plant. All right, and again, the Calvin cycle occurs in the stroma of the chloroplast. All right, so here's again a general overview. Where does the light-dependent reaction occur? It occurs on the thylakoid membrane. What are the reactants for the light-dependent reaction? They're right here. There's sunlight, water. We have NADP plus, okay, and ADP and ADP. All right, so those are the reactants of the light-dependent reaction, and then the products produced from the light-dependent reaction are ATP and NADP plus, which are going to be used in the Calvin cycle. Now that we're in the Calvin cycle, where does that occur? It occurs in the stroma. What are the reactants? The reactants are ATP and NADPH, which are stored energy molecules which contain high energy electrons. Also, we are going to see carbon dioxide coming in and being reduced into sugars. What are the products? The product of the Calvin cycle, the main product here is glucose, as well as ADP and NAD plus, which are going to go back into the light-dependent reaction to gain that extra phosphate and hydrogen so that they can be used again in the Calvin cycle. All right, that is all I have on the light independent reaction. So just a little recap, make sure you know where the light independent reaction occurs, what are the reactants for the light independent reaction, and what are the products, what is being produced. And again, the main product here is glucose. So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I will be providing you with a lot of worksheets just to reinforce this and review it over and over and over again so that you really can master this. All right. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me, and I will talk to you soon.